In the fall of 1986, the southern coal fields of West Virginia were already dying, even if the people living there didn't want to say it out loud yet. Mines that had fed entire counties for 3 generations were shutting down one by one. Logging outfits folded. Rail spurs rusted. Towns that once ran on 3 shifts a day were reduced to pawnshops, churches, and bars that opened before noon. Men who had spent their lives underground or in the woods woke up one morning and discovered the world no longer needed them. In Mingo County, tucked into a bend of the Tug Fork River, that collapse felt personal. The land there was steep and unforgiving, a maze of ridges and hollows where sound carried strangely, and neighbors could live a mile apart, yet know each other's business better than their own. Law enforcement coverage was thin. Deputies covered hundreds of square miles. State police were an hour away on good roads. Federal presence existed mostly as rumor, something you heard about on the news, not something you expected to see in your driveway. Earl Whitaker had worked since he was 16, first in the mines, then in logging when the coal company cut its workforce in half. By 1986, he was 49 years old, broad-shouldered but worn down, with hands permanently cracked from decades of hard labor. He owned a small, aging logging rig, a battered skidder, a flatbed truck, and a portable sawmill he'd bought piece by piece over nearly 5 years. It wasn't impressive to outsiders, but to Earl, it was everything. It was how he fed his family after the company jobs disappeared. It was his last tie to independence. The equipment wasn't insured. Insurance companies didn't bother with men like Earl anymore. Premiums were too high, payouts too uncertain. If something happened to that rig, there was no safety net, no second chance. Earl lived with his wife, Ruth, and their 2 sons, Daniel and Luke, in a weathered house halfway up a ridge. The boys were grown, both in their 20s, both working with him when they could. Daniel had a wife and a newborn daughter. Luke was unmarried, restless, already talking about leaving West Virginia for Ohio or Indiana, anywhere with factories still hiring. On Sunday mornings, Earl sat at the kitchen table before dawn, drinking black coffee and listening to the radio weather report. He liked knowing what the mountains were about to do before stepping into them. That fall, the air had turned sharp early. Fog clung to the hollows long after sunrise. It made theft easy. It made movement invisible. Everyone in Mingo County knew that stealing equipment wasn't the same as stealing cash. You stole a man's tools, you stole his future. There was an unspoken rule about it. Break that rule, and the consequences didn't always come through a courtroom. The first theft happened on October 3, 1986. Earl arrived at a logging site just after sunrise and found the chains gone. Heavy-duty chains, not something that wandered off on its own. The skidder was still there, but someone had stripped parts from it during the night. Nothing catastrophic, but deliberate. A message. He reported it to the sheriff's office anyway. The deputy took notes, nodded sympathetically, and told Earl they'd keep an eye out. Earl knew what that meant. Nothing would happen. 2 weeks later, the flatbed truck disappeared. Not damaged, not stripped, gone. Tracks showed it had been driven out along an old service road that hadn't been maintained in years. Whoever took it knew the land, knew which roads still connected and which ones dead-ended into ravines. This wasn't random. This was targeted. Earl didn't call the sheriff that time. He didn't need to hear the same empty assurances. Instead, he drove into town and started asking quiet questions. Who'd been seen near the ridge? Who was suddenly moving equipment they didn't own last month? In places like Mingo County, secrets didn't stay buried long. The name that kept coming back was Mason Klein. Mason was 36, lean, sharp-eyed, and known for cutting corners. He ran a small salvage and resale operation out of an abandoned strip mine yard. Everyone knew he dealt in stolen goods. Everyone also knew he had cousins, brothers-in-law, and friends willing to do the dirty work. He wasn't violent by reputation, just opportunistic. He took what he thought people wouldn't fight over. Earl drove to Mason's yard on October 19th. He didn't bring a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked where his truck was. Mason denied everything with a smile that never reached his eyes. Said Earl must have misplaced it. Said theft accusations were serious and dangerous talk. Earl gave him until the following Saturday to make things right. That conversation traveled faster than Earl expected. By nightfall, half the county knew there was trouble coming. Most people assumed it would blow over. Usually did. Men argued, cooled off, moved on. Everyone had too much to lose. But by Saturday, the truck hadn't come back. Neither had the skidder parts. What did come instead was silence. Earl spent that evening sitting on his porch, watching fog swallow the valley below. Ruth asked him to let it go, to walk away before things got worse. Earl didn't answer. He wasn't angry in the way people expect. He felt something colder, a sense that a line had been crossed and left unaddressed. The next morning, Daniel showed up early, holding his daughter in one arm. He asked his father what they were going to do now. Earl looked at his granddaughter's face, still red and wrinkled from birth, and understood that whatever came next would shape not just his life, but hers. That was the moment the decision formed, even if he didn't name it yet. Over the next 3 weeks, more equipment vanished from other sites around the county. Not just Earl's. 2 loggers lost saws, 1 lost a loader. Rumors circulated that Mason Klein was building something bigger, consolidating equipment to sell out of state. Law enforcement made a few token visits. Nothing stuck. By November, winter was closing in. Work would slow to a crawl even without theft. For men like Earl, this was the last window to earn enough to survive until spring. On November 14th, Earl found the remains of his flatbed truck. It had been burned out on a back road near the state line. Frame warped, engine ruined. Whatever profit Mason planned to make, he'd already taken it. The message was clear now. There would be no restitution. That night, Earl gathered his sons in the kitchen. He laid out what he knew, what he suspected, what he feared would happen if nothing changed. Luke argued they should leave, cut their losses, start over somewhere else. Daniel stayed quiet, watching his father closely. Earl didn't talk about violence. He didn't need to. In Mingo County, everyone understood what certain silences meant. By the end of that week, Earl began preparing, not impulsively, not emotionally, methodically. He visited relatives he hadn't seen in months. He checked old hunting rifles, cleaned them, replaced worn parts. He studied maps of ridges and service roads he'd walked since childhood. He wrote things down, names, schedules, patterns. What he didn't know was that Mason Klein had noticed too. Mason heard the same rumors, heard that Earl Whitaker wasn't backing down, heard that men were talking. Mason believed talk was cheap. He believed fear traveled faster than resolve. He assumed, like most people did, that nothing serious would happen, that West Virginia had seen worse threats come and go. Both men were wrong about one thing. Once a certain threshold is crossed, there is no returning to normal. There is only momentum. By the time December arrived, Mingo County was already set on a path it wouldn't understand. until years later, when reporters would call it something dramatic and clean, stripping away the human confusion that made it possible. At the time, it was just men trying to survive in a place that no longer had room for them. And the night that would define everything was already approaching, unnoticed, quiet, waiting for the fog to roll in again. December settled over Mingo County like a lid, sealing everything in. Snow didn't fall yet, but frost did, thick and brittle, turning back roads into glass before sunrise. Logging slowed to almost nothing. Men stayed home, drank more, talked less. In places like this, winter wasn't just weather. It was pressure. Earl Whitaker moved through those weeks quietly. To neighbors, he looked like any other man riding out the season. He fixed what tools he had left. He cut firewood. He went to church on Sundays and sat in the same pew he'd occupied for 20 years. But underneath that routine, something had hardened. He stopped asking questions in public. He already had answers. Mason, Klein's operation had expanded. Earl confirmed it by watching, not confronting. Trucks came and went from the strip mine yard at odd hours. Equipment Earl recognized from other logging outfits appeared briefly, then disappeared again. Mason wasn't hoarding anymore. He was liquidating, selling fast. That meant one thing. He was getting ready to leave. If Mason made it out of the county with cash in hand, there would be no justice of any kind. Not legal, not informal. Just a clean escape and a lesson to everyone else. Take what you want, move on, face nothing. That idea bothered Earl more than the theft itself. It wasn't pride, it wasn't revenge, it was the precedent. In places already stripped of stability, precedent mattered. If men learned there were no consequences left at all, the collapse would accelerate. Daniel noticed the change in his father before anyone else did. Earl spoke less, slept less. When he did sleep, he woke before dawn and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Daniel asked him once, directly, what he planned to do. Earl answered honestly, "I'm not letting him walk away." Daniel didn't argue. He understood the language beneath the words, but Luke did. Luke confronted Earl 3 days later, anger and fear mixed together. He said this wasn't worth prison or death. Said Mason wasn't worth destroying what was left of their family. Said they could leave, start over somewhere nobody knew their names. Earl listened. Then he told Luke something he'd never said out loud before. "If I leave now," he said, "I'm teaching your niece that men like us don't matter, that anyone stronger or dirtier can take what we build and face nothing. I won't teach her that." Luke left the house that night and didn't come back until morning. After that, Earl stopped discussing it. Instead, he prepared in ways that looked ordinary but weren't. He checked hunting licenses. He made sure everything he owned was registered and legal. He documented purchases. He wrote dates in a notebook. If someone ever found it, it would look like a man clinging to order as long as possible. Daniel helped without being asked. He never said the word plan, but he followed instructions. He learned routes. He memorized schedules. He practiced silence. What none of them knew yet was that Mason Klein had begun preparing too. Mason wasn't stupid. He didn't believe in Appalachian codes or old ideas of honor, but he understood fear. And fear told him Earl Whitaker wasn't bluffing. So Mason did what men like him always did when pressure rose. He gathered people, not family, not sons, associates, men with nothing to lose and no long-term loyalty. He armed them poorly, trained them not at all, and told them Earl was dangerous. Told them Whitaker was unstable, obsessed, possibly violent. Mason framed everything as self-defense before anything had happened. By mid-December, both sides believed they were reacting, not initiating. That illusion is how things slip out of control. On December 18th, a logging crew found one of Mason's men beaten badly near an access road. No witnesses, no statements. The man refused to name who'd done it. Sheriff's deputies wrote it up as an assault by unknown parties. The rumor mill filled the gaps. Some said Earl was sending warnings. Others said Mason was staging incidents to justify something bigger. The truth didn't matter anymore. Everyone sensed momentum. The final catalyst came 3 days before Christmas. Earl returned home to find his house searched. Not ransacked, not vandalized, searched. Drawers opened neatly, papers moved but not stolen. A message that someone had been inside, close to his family, while he was gone. Ruth sat at the table shaking, holding Earl's granddaughter, who wouldn't stop crying. Earl walked through every room slowly, taking inventory. Nothing missing, nothing broken. Just the violation. That night. Earl made the decision fully, consciously, without anger. He told Daniel to make arrangements, to ensure Ruth and the baby would be somewhere else for a few days, to say nothing about why. Daniel understood. Luke came home late that night and saw the rifles laid out on the table. Cleaned. Ready. He didn't speak. He packed a bag and left again, choosing distance over complicity. Earl didn't stop him. December 22nd arrived cold and windless. Fog settled into the hollows early, thick enough to swallow headlights. Mason Klein's strip mine yard was active that night. A final shipment. Earl knew because he'd watched for weeks. This was the window. What happened next would later be described as an ambush, an execution, a massacre, depending on who told the story. Investigators would debate who fired first for years. Lawyers would argue intent. Journalists would reduce it to headlines. But on that night, it unfolded as something far messier. Men moved in darkness, convinced they were already under threat. Earl and Daniel positioned themselves along an access road Mason's trucks had to use. They didn't speak. They didn't rush. They waited. They believed confrontation would force answers, force accountability. When the first truck appeared, headlights cutting through fog, someone panicked. A shot cracked the night. Nobody would ever prove who fired it. What followed lasted less than 10 minutes. Gunfire echoed off the ridges, distorted, overlapping. Men ran. Trucks stalled. Someone screamed. Someone else fell. Fog swallowed everything, making targets into shapes, shapes into guesses. By the time the noise stopped, 6 men were down. 3 from Mason's group, 2 from Earl's side. 1 whose affiliation nobody could immediately confirm. Earl Whitaker stood in the road, rifle lowered, knowing the moment for control had passed forever. Daniel was wounded, but alive. Mason Klein was nowhere to be found. Sirens began to sound in the distance, delayed by terrain and confusion, but inevitable now. Earl did not run. He sat on the tailgate of his truck and waited for law enforcement to arrive, hands visible, breathing slow, accepting what had been set in motion long before a single shot was fired. By Christmas morning, Mingo County would wake to roadblocks, helicopters, and national news vans. And the question everyone would ask was the same one nobody could answer cleanly. At what point does survival turn into something else entirely? And who decides where that line really is? By dawn, the fog thinned and revealed what the night had hidden. A strip mine access road scarred with tire ruts, shattered glass, and dark stains that state troopers would photograph from every angle. each image flattening chaos into evidence. While Earl Whitaker sat exactly where he had when the first cruiser arrived, hands on his knees, jacket zipped against the cold, saying nothing except his name and confirming he was unarmed, a posture that confused the deputies who had expected flight or resistance, but found only a man who looked emptied out. As Daniel was loaded into an ambulance with a bullet crease along his shoulder that burned but hadn't broken bone, and the two other wounded were triaged in silence while investigators tried to reconstruct a fight nobody could fully describe, because every witness had seen a different version through fog and fear, and Mason Klein remained absent. His truck later found abandoned near a service road with the engine still warm, suggesting he'd slipped away during the confusion, leaving behind 3 associates dead or dying and a narrative vacuum that would be filled quickly by speculation. By noon, the county was sealed with roadblocks and the state police helicopter thumped overhead, the sound settling into people's bones as reporters arrived and neighbors whispered, some calling Earl a protector who'd finally pushed back, others calling him reckless, dangerous, proof that the county was tearing itself apart. And the sheriff held a press conference that said almost nothing, citing an active investigation and urging calm. While inside the courthouse, a prosecutor began sketching charges that ranged from aggravated assault to homicide, each dependent on the same unanswered question of who fired first, which would become the axis on which every legal argument turned. Because ballistics could show trajectories, but not intentions, and intentions were all that mattered now. Daniel survived surgery and asked only whether his father was safe, and Earl refused counsel for a day, insisting first on seeing Ruth and his granddaughter. The brief visit supervised and wordless except for the way Ruth pressed her forehead to his and whispered that she loved him no matter what came next. And when counsel finally arrived, they advised silence, which Earl accepted, understanding that words would only harden positions already forming, as Mason Klein resurfaced 2 days later in another county with a lawyer and a story that painted himself as a target of an armed ambush, a version that conflicted with physical evidence but aligned neatly with his interest in avoiding charges. And the investigation widened, subpoenas issued, phones analyzed, and a ledger found in Mason's office that suggested rapid liquidation of stolen equipment, tying motive to money and flight rather than self-defense, yet still leaving space for doubt because doubt was plentiful and clarity scarce. Funerals followed quickly and quietly, the kind held early to avoid cameras, families choosing grief over statements, while online the story metastasized into absolutes that ignored the gray. And as weeks passed, the grand jury returned indictments that stopped short of first-degree murder, reflecting the uncertainty baked into the case, charging Earl with voluntary manslaughter and weapons violations, and charging Mason with theft, conspiracy, and obstruction. A split decision that pleased no one fully and enraged both sides equally. And at trial, the fog became a character in its own right. Experts testified about sound distortion and visibility, about how men under stress misperceive sequence and threat, while character witnesses described Earl as steady and Mason as opportunistic, and the jury watched grainy footage and listened to recordings that captured nothing decisive, only the crack of a shot and then chaos. And when the verdict came, it felt less like justice than an accounting. Earl convicted on lesser counts, sentenced to years rather than life. Daniel acquitted on self-defense grounds. Mason convicted on theft and conspiracy, but spared the worst outcomes by distance and delay. And the county exhaled without relief, because the outcome didn't restore anything that had been lost. It only closed a chapter with rough edges. Earl entered prison older than his years and left behind a family that would rebuild slowly and unevenly. Mason eventually, served his time and moved on, carrying the unspoken knowledge that escape had failed him in the end. And Mingo County learned again that when systems thin and trust collapses, men improvise justice in the dark, and the dark answers back, leaving scars that persist long after the fog lifts and the headlines fade. Prison did not change Earl Whitaker so much as compress him, days folding into each other with the slow pressure of routine until memory sharpened into a narrow blade he carried everywhere. The clang of count, the smell of disinfectant, the yard conversations that circled the same themes of blame and chance, and letters from Ruth that described a life rebuilding around absence. The house repainted, the truck sold, the granddaughter learning to read, while outside the county tried to forget by reframing the night as an aberration rather than a warning. The mines reopening briefly under new ownership and then closing again, the same pattern repeating with different names, as appeals ground forward and legal language attempted to sand the story into manageable edges, experts revisiting trajectories and timing without changing conclusions, because the truth had already settled into a shape that could not be improved by precision. And Mason Klein's name surfaced intermittently in civil filings and local rumor. His businesses shuttered, assets seized, reputation ruined in places that remembered, intact where nobody asked. While Daniel healed and returned to work quieter than before, carrying guilt that acquittal could not erase. And when Earl was released early on good behavior, he stepped back into a world that had moved on without him, finding the holler narrower, the people older, the silence heavier. And though some shook his hand and called him brave, others crossed the road, unwilling to reopen wounds. And Earl accepted both reactions with the same flat nod, choosing work that kept him busy and nights that kept him sober, attending his granddaughter's school events from the back row, present but careful. And in time the case receded into footnotes and cautionary lectures, cited when tempers flared and someone mentioned the night the fog swallowed judgment. A reminder that desperation sharpens choices and that violence rarely arrives alone. It brings consequences that linger, shaping lives in ways no verdict can undo. And in the end, the county learned nothing new, only the old lesson restated. When law thins and trust breaks, men will write their own rules, and the bill will be paid slowly by everyone long after the noise is gone. Years later, the road was repaved and the access gate replaced. The mine signs updated with corporate logos that promised safety and permanence. And visitors drove past without knowing why locals still slowed there. Why older men fell quiet when fog rolled in. Because memory attaches to places even when the marks are scrubbed away. And Earl Whitaker lived with that attachment like a low ache, volunteering at the fire hall, fixing fences for neighbors who didn't ask questions, teaching his granddaughter how to cast a line in the creek and warning her about slippery stones. Not about the night that took so much, because children deserve daylight before they inherit shadows, while Ruth kept the house simple and clean and refused interviews, saying nothing new could be said without reopening old wounds. And Daniel moved farther out, a practical exile, the kind chosen to keep peace. And Mason Klein became a name people used as shorthand for greed that outran sense. His arc reduced to a cautionary tale stripped of nuance, convenient and incomplete. And on anniversaries, the county paper ran a brief item noting the date without adjectives, just facts, because adjectives invite argument, and the argument never truly ends. It only quiets, resurfacing when jobs vanish or tempers flare, and the younger ones listen without fully believing until pressure makes belief unnecessary, until choice narrows and the fog comes down again. And if there was a lesson, it wasn't heroic or clean. It was procedural and grim. Systems fail in increments. Trust erodes quietly, and violence arrives dressed as necessity, promising resolution and delivering only aftermath. A balance sheet of losses spread across years, and those who lived through it learned to count carefully, to speak softly when anger rose, to remember that the night had not made heroes or villains so much as it had exposed fault lines already there. And when the fog lifted, it revealed not answers, but a map of consequences. One the county would follow whether it wanted to or not, step by cautious step, carrying forward what remained. Time did what verdicts could not, and flattened the edges, not erasing what happened, but dulling its immediacy until it lived mostly in posture and tone, in the way people checked mirrors twice before turning onto that road, and the way arguments ended early when voices rose because nobody wanted another lesson delivered the hard way. Earl aged into routine, mornings at the diner with the same men, afternoons repairing what broke, evenings home before dark. The discipline of restraint learned too late but practiced faithfully, and when his granddaughter asked why some people looked at him strangely, he said only that grown men sometimes make choices that cost more than they expect, and she accepted it because children trust the cadence of honesty even when details are withheld. While Ruth kept a box of letters and court papers she never opened again, understanding that memory needs a container or it spills everywhere, and Daniel's life narrowed to work and sleep. His acquittal a legal fact that never became an emotional one. And Mason's name vanished from conversation, as names do when they no longer serve a purpose, replaced by new actors repeating old patterns under different banners, and the county's economy lurched forward and back. Grants announced, projects canceled, hope rationed, until the night became a reference point rather than a wound, cited when someone said it can't happen here, because it already had. And the sheriff who spoke at retirements said the same thing every time, that peace is maintained not by force alone, but by patience and proximity, by showing up before the fog does, and the people nodded because they understood, having paid the tuition already, and so life continued, imperfect and watchful. The kind that grows after something breaks, not whole again, but functional, carrying forward with the knowledge that quiet is earned daily, and once lost, it is expensive to buy back. The years after became a study in restraint, how a place learns to live with what it did without naming it every day, and the silence itself took on weight, measured in small decisions like locking doors earlier, settling debts face to face, walking away when pride flared. Earl becoming a fixed point rather than a spectacle, the man who showed up and left early, who listened more than he spoke, whose presence reminded people that lines once crossed do not uncross, while Ruth insisted on ordinary rituals that refused to let the past dictate the present. Sunday dinners, birthdays, a garden kept tidy, and the granddaughter grew into questions that demanded steadier answers, learning that truth can be layered without being false, that a person can be responsible and still loved. And Daniel's name drifted into the background as his health failed and work consumed him, the acquittal never translating into peace. And when he died quietly years later, the notice was brief and factual. No adjectives, no commentary, because the county had learned what commentary costs, and Mason's story resolved elsewhere in ways nobody here tracked. A reminder that consequences do not always return to the place they began, while new disputes rose and fell and were handled faster, cooler, the memory acting as ballast, and when outsiders asked why people here avoided the details, the answer was simple and sufficient, because we know how it ends, and knowing the end makes the beginning easier to stop. And so the night receded into a shared understanding rather than a shared argument. a boundary drawn without signage, respected because it had been paid for already, and the quiet held, not because it was natural, but because it was chosen again and again by people who understood the price of forgetting. Eventually, the story lost its sharpness and became a contour on the county's map, something you felt more than saw, shaping how meetings ran and how deals were struck, with elders insisting on witnesses and paper where once a handshake would do, and younger folks absorbing the caution without realizing where it came from. Earl attending a mediation workshop at the courthouse and finding it oddly familiar, the language of de-escalation echoing lessons learned the hard way. Ruth hosting a graduation party that filled the yard with laughter and music and felt like a small victory. Daniel's absence turning into a quiet footnote rather than a presence, and the sheriff's office instituting earlier interventions for disputes tied to jobs and land. Because pressure points were predictable even if outcomes weren't, and when the mine reopened under a short contract and then closed again, people shrugged instead of raged, having learned that fury spends itself fastest on those who can least afford it. And on foggy mornings, drivers still slowed at that bend. A reflex passed down without explanation, while the paper ran a feature on resilience that mentioned the night only obliquely, crediting the county's restraint rather than its trauma. And at a school assembly, a counselor said that anger is information, not instruction, a phrase that stuck. And when the anniversary came and went without comment, it felt like progress of a sort, not forgetting but choosing what to carry forward. And the county did what counties do. It lived, imperfectly and attentively, honoring the quiet by maintaining it, aware that peace is not a permanent condition but a practice, one that demands vigilance long after the fog has lifted and the road looks ordinary again. In the end, it wasn't a confession or a verdict that closed the ledger. It was a series of ordinary days that added up to something like resolution. Earl waking earlier as his body stiffened, walking the same short loop along the creek and counting birds, because counting kept his mind from replaying sequences that no longer mattered. Ruth downsizing the house and giving away furniture that carried too much memory. The granddaughter leaving for college with a scholarship that felt improbably earned. The county updating ordinances and funding a mediation office that quietly prevented small disputes from calcifying into dangerous ones. And when reporters circled back years later hoping for a retrospective hook, they found none. Only people unwilling to be simplified, because simplification had fueled the worst misunderstandings of that night. And the truth, when stated plainly, resisted virality. That a system strained by scarcity invites shortcuts. That shortcuts invite confrontation, and confrontation under fog and fear invites irreversible decisions. Lessons that did not require villains to be true, only context. And as the last civil case settled without admission and the last appeal window closed, the story's energy dissipated into a shared ethic of caution, the kind that doesn't announce itself but shows up in pauses and paperwork and a preference for daylight. Earl declined a local award offered by the fire hall, saying he didn't want his name attached to anything commemorative, and the chief understood because commemorations freeze moments that should remain warnings, not monuments. And on a late autumn evening when the fog rolled in again, thick and sudden, Earl and Ruth sat on the porch with coffee and watched it move through the trees, saying little, knowing that silence can be a form of care. And when Earl's health finally failed years later, the notice was brief and kind, survivors listed without commentary, and the service drew a crowd that kept respectful distance, not out of fear but out of maturity. The recognition that some stories are honored best by restraint, and the county carried on, not healed in the sentimental sense, but steadied. having learned that peace is cumulative, built from many small refusals to escalate, and that the most durable justice is preventive. Arriving before anger convinces men that necessity excuses everything, a lesson paid for once and remembered quietly thereafter. What finally endured was not the night itself, but the boundary it etched into communal behavior, a tacit agreement that escalation would be intercepted early, that grievances would be documented, witnesses invited, tempers cooled before pride could masquerade as principle, and this discipline showed up in unremarkable ways. A contractor calling the courthouse instead of the cousin with a temper, a foreman pausing a shift to settle pay disputes in daylight, a pastor opening the fellowship hall for mediation rather than prayer alone, and Earl's absence, once so loud, became a quiet proof that restraint can outlive notoriety. Ruth aging into a gentler authority, whose opinions carried weight because they were careful. The granddaughter returning after college to teach and finding that students listened when she spoke about consequences without dramatics. Daniel's name receding into private memory rather than public shorthand, and Mason's story dissolving into the broader caution that opportunity without accountability corrodes. And on foggy mornings the county's habits held, drivers slowed, radios turned down, conversations deferred, because practice had replaced impulse, and when a new dispute threatened to harden, it was met with paperwork and patience, not bravado, the kind of response that feels unsatisfying until it saves a life, and the local paper eventually stopped running anniversary briefs altogether, not from denial, but because the absence of spectacle marked progress. And when an outside filmmaker asked for interviews to revisit the truth, most declined, understanding that truth here was procedural and preventive, not cinematic. And the sheriff at the time summed it up without flourish, saying, "We learned that order isn't imposed at the moment of crisis. It's maintained long before." And the people nodded, having seen the alternative. And so the line held, not because everyone agreed, but because enough people chose caution when it counted. And that choice, repeated across years, became the county's quiet inheritance. A steadiness that didn't promise perfection. Only fewer nights where fog and fear could conspire to decide things for men who would have to live with the aftermath. And in that steadiness, the story ended the only way it could, not with absolution or spectacle, but with practice. The daily work of refusing to let necessity become an excuse and letting the quiet do its job. By the time a full generation had passed, the night existed less as a memory than as a method, a way of handling trouble that parents taught without naming, explaining to teenagers why paperwork mattered, why voices stayed low, why walking away was not weakness but strategy. And this inheritance proved sturdier than any monument, because it lived in choices made under pressure. The clerk who insisted on receipts, the foreman who split crews before arguments hardened, the judge who expanded diversion programs knowing prevention is cheaper than punishment, and Ruth, now slowed by age, watching from her window as seasons turned and believing, not without effort, that the future had been bent slightly away from the worst outcomes. The granddaughter raising a family of her own and telling stories that emphasized consequences rather than drama. Daniel's absence settling into genealogy rather than gossip. Mason's name evaporating entirely, useful once as a warning and then discarded. And when fog rolled in thick enough to swallow the ridge, people still slowed, still waited, still chose daylight, because habit had replaced fear, and fear is brittle but habit holds. And if the county could be said to have learned anything, it was that stability is assembled, not declared, built from refusals to escalate and from systems strengthened before desperation narrows the field. And so the final accounting was not a ledger of blame but a balance of outcomes. Fewer funerals, fewer sirens, more mournings that arrived without incident. A modest victory earned incrementally. And when someone asked whether justice had been served, the answer remained unsatisfying and true. Justice arrived late and incomplete, but prevention arrived early enough to matter. And that was the lesson that endured, that the most important work happens long before anyone reaches for a weapon, long before fog and fear rewrite intentions, and that holding the line is not a moment, but a practice. One the county continued quietly, knowing the cost of forgetting and the value of restraint. There was no ceremony to mark the end, no final document stamped complete. Only the gradual recognition that the county no longer needed the story to explain itself, that it had internalized the lesson and moved on without fanfare. The way places do when survival depends on not reopening old fractures, and the night became a reference embedded in procedure rather than conversation, cited obliquely in training manuals and budget hearings, invoked silently when tempers rose and then cooled. And this was not redemption so much as maintenance, the steady upkeep of boundaries that had once failed. Earl's name settling into the background of civic memory, alongside other hard chapters, neither lionized nor erased, simply acknowledged as part of the cost paid. Ruth passing quietly in her sleep years later, with neighbors attending the service out of respect rather than curiosity. The granddaughter standing at the lectern and speaking about care and restraint, about choosing outcomes that do not multiply harm. Words shaped by inheritance rather than instruction, and the county listened because it recognized itself in that posture. And when fog rolled in again, as it always did, drivers slowed out of habit, meetings adjourned early, arguments deferred because the discipline had become instinct, and the absence of crisis felt like success, even if it never made headlines. And if an ending must be named, it would be this: that nothing dramatic happened, no final reckoning arrived, no single answer resolved the contradictions. Only a long series of choices that favored prevention over pride, daylight over bravado, process over impulse. And this unremarkable ending was the point. Because the opposite had been too expensive, and the county carried forward with the knowledge that systems must be fed and watched, that desperation narrows options until violence pretends to be necessary, and that the work of peace is repetitive and quiet, and therefore easy to neglect, and so they did not neglect it. Not because they were better than anyone else, but because they remembered the bill, and remembering proved sufficient. And the story, finally, ended not with absolution or spectacle, but with continuity, a place choosing again and again to hold the line, aware that the line exists only so long as people keep it, and that keeping it is the only ending that lasts. Long after the last appeal expired, and the files were boxed and archived, the county's relationship to the night settled into something practical, a checklist more than a myth, a set of thresholds written and unwritten that guided responses before pressure could metastasize, and this practicality proved contagious. Neighboring counties adopting similar mediation protocols, sharing grant writers, training deputies to identify disputes tied to wages and land before they calcified. Small bureaucratic victories that never made news but reduced the number of calls that arrived after midnight, and the people noticed even if they didn't articulate it. Noticing that arguments cooled faster, that grudges were interrupted by process, that daylight was invited into conflicts early, and this shift did not eliminate anger or greed or fear. It merely shortened their reach. And when a younger generation asked why elders insisted on signatures and witnesses and cooling off periods, the answer remained consistent and unsensational, because we've seen where shortcuts lead. And that answer carried more authority than any speech, because it was lived, and the old road where it began became indistinguishable from others. Its danger not in appearance, but in memory, which is how lessons should age, becoming guidance rather than spectacle. And on an ordinary evening when a storm rolled through and fog pooled low, a council meeting adjourned early, not from panic but prudence, and people went home without incident, and nobody remarked on it because normalcy had become the achievement. And if there was a final measure, it was this: that the county's greatest success was forgetting to be afraid while remembering to be careful. A balance learned the hard way and maintained without applause. And the story concluded not because it demanded an ending, but because it had been absorbed, transformed into habit, leaving behind a quieter place that understood the difference between strength and escalation, and chose repeatedly to honor that difference, knowing the cost of failing to do so had already been paid once and would not be paid again. Stability, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with relief or celebration. It arrived like a habit you realize you've been practicing without noticing, in budgets that funded mediators before overtime, in school programs that taught conflict as something to be managed rather than won, in deputies trained to recognize when pride was about to outrun reason, and these decisions accumulated until the county felt different without ever claiming to be changed, and people who moved in later sensed it without knowing why, remarking that things here were calmer, slower to flare, as if the place itself resisted extremes, and that resistance came from memory embedded in procedure, not from fear of repeating a night, but from confidence that there were better tools now. And on anniversaries nothing was said because nothing needed to be said. The lesson had already been paid for and filed into practice. Earl's story lingering only in the way older men paused before speaking. Ruth's name mentioned with respect when someone spoke about endurance. Daniel remembered privately by those who loved him and publicly by no one. Mason reduced to a caution that never needed retelling. And when a neighboring county faced its own crisis and asked for guidance, the advice was unremarkable and effective. Slow it down, bring it into daylight, widen the table. Let time do its work, because time, it turned out, was the most reliable ally, and the fog, once a symbol of danger, became just weather again, something to plan around rather than something that decided outcomes. And the county's quiet held not because people were better, but because systems were thicker, because choices had more off-ramps, because escalation no longer felt inevitable. And if there was an ending worth naming, it was this: that the place learned how to outgrow its worst night without denying it, converting memory into maintenance, grief into guardrails, and fear into discipline. And that conversion, slow and unspectacular, proved more durable than any verdict or speech, leaving behind a community that understood the cost of shortcuts and chose, again and again, to do the slower thing, the thing that keeps mornings ordinary and nights uneventful, and in that ordinariness found the only ending that lasts.